Boring history for sleep. The curious case of the Viking who loved hot baths. Story 1. The curious case of the Viking who loved hot baths. Section 1. Steam, snow, and silence. Viking baths in the cold north. Thu might not picture a Viking quietly reclining in a tub of steaming water, breathing in the scent of birchwood smoke and spruce needles, but that's exactly where our story begins. When most people think of the Viking Age, roughly 793 to 1066 CE, they imagine longships slicing through icy fjords, warriors in fur and iron, and epic sagas told by firelight. Yet, for all the axe-throwing and raiding, there existed another side to Viking life, one centered around surprising calm, routine cleanliness, and hot baths. Our story follows a man named Norseman, a particularly important figure in the Norse sagas. But we know from fragments of land records and snippets in household scrolls that he lived in what is now Western Iceland in the early 11th century. Urgils, a farmer and part-time saga poet known as a Celt, was reportedly so fond of bathing that neighbors joked he would sail to the hot springs before milking his goats. To understand why this was unusual and yet oddly not, we must look more broadly at Viking hygiene culture, the clean Norseman. Fact or fiction? Vikings, contrary to the popular image of mud-streaked savages, were often among the cleanest people in early medieval Europe. Archaeological finds from Norse sites routinely reveal tweezers, ear picks, combs, and razors, tools of fastidious daily use. The weekly bath, or lagadagar, literally bath day, which survives as lørdag or Saturday in Scandinavian languages, was a cultural fixture. Foreign observers, like the Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan, noted how Vikings washed their faces and combed their hair every morning using bowls of water that were passed around. Though he found the communal style disgusting, his commentary shows that washing was routine. Public hot springs and communal bathhouses, especially in places like Iceland and parts of Norway, were important gathering points. In fact, early Icelandic settlements were often established near geothermal vents and hot rivers. These were not just seen as luxuries, but as practical, life-sustaining tools in a harsh climate. In this context, Urgil's obsession with bathing doesn't seem so odd. What makes it curious is the extent to which he pursued it. Urgil's and the spring of his obsession. The Landnámabók, a medieval Icelandic manuscript cataloging early settlers, mentions a small farming valley known for its unusually warm stream, heated by a fault line. Later additions to the manuscript mention Urgils the Clean, who was known to walk 2 hours each way daily, to sit in the steaming pools, Why would a Viking farmer, with animals to tend and hay to scythe, spend this much time bathing? Some historians believe it was due to chronic joint pain. Icelandic weather is damp and brutal in the winter. The benefits of geothermal baths for arthritis and stiffness were recognized even in ancient times. Roman legions built thermae wherever they found warm water. The same logic may have applied here. Urgils may have suffered from a long-healed injury, and the springs offered relief. But the saga fragments also hint at something gentler. Psychological refuge. A place to think. Slowly, according to a surviving verse attributed to Urgils in misted stone and Waterdeep, where steam, like ghosts, begins to creep. My heart sits down beside my mind, and both leave battle farms behind. This isn't a poem of conquest, it's about withdrawal. Urgil's Esbath was not just an escape from cold, it was an escape from noise. In an age where status was often defined by strength and property, the idea of stillness was itself quietly radical. And while the modern term mental health didn't exist, medieval people were no strangers to stress, grief, and trauma. Life was short, violent, and uncertain. Perhaps hot water helped make sense of it. Even in Norse mythology, hot springs appear in calming, purifying roles. The goddess Frigg was said to bathe in sacred waters to see the future. In other stories, the gods cleansed themselves before great decisions. Could it be that Urgils saw his morning ritual as a way to touch the divine, or at least to think more clearly? We'll likely never know for sure, but in the sagas, action always follows reflection. The bath, then, might have been the true start of his day. What a Viking bath looked like, it wasn't exactly a porcelain tub filled with eucalyptus-scented suds. The early Icelandic hot baths were simple pits or low stone enclosures dug into the earth where geothermal water pooled naturally. Some were enclosed with turf walls to block the wind. Others had wooden troughs guiding the warm flow into a basin. If water was too hot, cold river water was diverted to cool it. Bathers might bring bundles of birch branches used for both scent and light whipping, not as painful as it sounds. Think of it as early exfoliation. Unlike the Roman or later Turkish bathhouses, these were quiet, individual or family spaces, rarely bustling with crowds. People often bathed naked, though with full awareness of modesty and etiquette. There were also superstitions around the springs. Stories abounded of elves, huldafolk, and trolls inhabiting the steam. Bathers were advised to offer a pinch of oats or a whispered verse when entering, especially in secluded places. Urgils, reportedly, never skipped this ritual. A curious, local reputation, despite being considered unusually fastidious, Urgil's was not ridiculed in his village. In fact, local sayings seemed to admire his routine. A preserved proverb from the region states, "Be as regular as Urgil's at the spring, warm, early, and never loud." He was seen as dependable, and his poetry, usually about moss, stones, and clouds, was passed down orally for generations. His hot bath routine became almost mythic, and children were warned not to interrupt him mid-soak unless the goats were actually on fire. But what happened when his spring dried up? According to the fragment known as the Snorra Scrolls, a minor tremor altered the flow of the geothermal stream one winter. Urgil's found the water suddenly tepid and cloudy, and from this small disturbance grew a much larger journey, one that took him across Iceland and into deep valleys in search of another spring. But why did he go to such lengths for a bath? Was it really about warmth? Or had bathing become something else entirely, for him a habit turned pilgrimage? Section 2. A soaking pilgrimage, the long search for warm waters when the spring that had cradled his daily solitude fell silent. Urgil's Snorrason didn't shout, he didn't cry, nor did he, as local legend goes, blame the gods or call a priest to investigate the earth's shifting fire beneath his valley. He simply sat by the lukewarm pool and waited until nightfall, as if hoping the heat would return. In single quotes, Iceland, shaped by volcanoes and earthquakes, often rearranged, itself with little warning. In Urgil's case, a mild tectonic disturbance, what 21st century geologists would call a microseismic event, redirected a fault-fed flow away from his bath. His beloved stream, once warm and clear, now trickled slowly, choked with silty residue from beneath the earth. But Urgil's was not one to be defeated by something as impersonal as geology. What followed was not a tantrum, nor a surrender to fate. It was, instead, an extraordinarily uneventful and gently stubborn journey, one that would eventually lead to 3 forgotten springs, a community of moss farmers, and a philosopher hermit who soaked birch bark to read the weather. Packing for a Viking spa tour, Urgil's set off with a modest pack. Inside, a comb made from reindeer antler, a chunk of lard soap, several lengths of rough linen for drying, and a carved birch ladala, gift from a neighbor. He brought little else. He was not chasing legend or fame. He was chasing routine. He missed the quiet hiss of steam against rock, the way fog laced through spruce branches before dawn, the predictable creak of turf beneath his bare feet. His first stop was the nearby homestead of Finnur Grimson, whose family had long claimed that a lukewarm pool on their land could revive the dead door. At least the cows, urgils, soaked in it once, only to find the water too shallow and filled with ducks. After an awkward conversation with Finnur's cousin, he moved on. The Moss people of Varma Valley. Further south lay Varma Valley, where the ground exhaled warm mist even in early spring. The residents, known as Moskar Bondermoss, farmers grew soft green carpet, moss used for bedding and insulation. Their turf houses smelled constantly of loam and steam, which suited Urgil's fine. Here he found a bath called Gamla Log, or the old soak, which had been used by generations. The bath was ringed by stones so evenly placed they resembled the teeth of some sleeping beast. No one knew who had arranged them, but the Moss people honored the layout, adding new stones. As older ones crumbled, Urgils soaked in the waters at dusk. He described it later in verse as neither hot nor cold, but the hour between breath and forgetting. He stayed for 3 nights, yet something felt off. The bath sat in a low place where wind rarely stirred, and after a while he missed the sharp scent of cold air mingling with steam. He thanked the Moss folk, gifted them to stanzas of poetry and a dried fish, and departed again. A scholar and the whispering pools, his next stop, took him east toward a quiet basin near Thingvellir, Iceland's old legislative plain. Here he encountered a peculiar man known as Bjarki, the birch watcher. Bjarki was a solitary thinker who had once studied in a monastery in the Hebrides and returned home with a habit of recording weather patterns by soaking strips of birch bark and reading their swelling. Some said he spoke with water. Others said he just muttered to himself too much. Bjarki maintained 3 separate geothermal pools, one for thinking, one for bathing, and one strictly for goats. Jules, amused and intrigued, asked to try all 3. The bathing pool was deep and crystal clear, shaded by wind-warped trees. While soaking, Bjarki and Urgils exchanged long silences and short, strange observations. Bjarki claimed that each bath had a different emotional tone: joy, clarity, sorrow. Urgils found this idea both absurd and oddly true. The 3rd bath, he later wrote, made me remember snow from my youth. I don't know why. It's a quiet reunion with an old friend on the 10th day of his journey. He stopped at an abandoned sheepfold near a forgotten trail. There, beside a stream half hidden by rocks and scrub, he noticed the scent of sulfur, faint but familiar, digging with his hands. He unearthed a narrow channel where warm water still ran underground. It had once been a feeder for a larger spring perhaps the same geothermal system that had nourished his home bath. Over the course of an afternoon, Urgils cleaned the channel, dug a small hollow, and lined it with smooth stones. He soaked as night fell, owls calling distantly through the mist. It wasn't as large as his original bath. It wasn't as perfectly tempered, but it was quiet, private, and earned. Here, Urgils began to compose what some call his soaking verses, a series of contemplative poems about water, wind, time, and the rhythms of stillness. Local children later carved some of the verses into driftwood and turf, leaving them around the valley as strange, poetic breadcrumbs for future wanderers, did he ever return. There is no record of Urgils returning permanently to his old spring, even when it purportedly began to warm again a year later. It's unclear whether this is because the spring never fully recovered, or because he had moved on spiritually or geographically by the time of his death, likely in the mid-11th century. He had become known not as a farmer, but as a wanderer of warm waters. His neighbors preserved his verses not because he was a great warrior or landowner, but because he seemed content. One of his last recorded sayings, passed down through oral tradition, was this: "If your gods cannot be found in the steam, they are likely hiding from something." Was Urgils simply an eccentric, a man who loved hot water more than people? Or was he, in his own quiet way, creating a philosophy of slowness, reflection, and attention long before such ideas were fashionable? What happens when we follow a routine so far it becomes its own kind of journey? Section 3. Steam, Silence, and a philosophy of warm water by the time Urgils Norseman was an old man, but whispered about in bathhouses and steam-filled valleys, usually in quiet tones, just above a sigh. He never led a battle. He owned no great hall. His livestock count was modest, and his lineage, while respectable, never produced jarls or law speakers. What he did possess, however, was a kind of stillness, a way of listening, especially to water. And over time, people began to notice, by the turn of the century, just before the Christianization of Iceland in the year 1000. There were already stories circulating of the bathwalker, an odd but peaceful man who never raised his voice, who wandered with a birch ladle and a comb, who could recite verses of warmth and fog as if reading from a sacred text. The people who came to soak at first, it was just neighbors. A curious shepherd here, a moss gatherer there. But over time, a small trickle of travelers began to seek him out. They didn't come for miracles. They came for something smaller and perhaps more meaningful. The experience of slowing down. These visitors would share a pool with Urgils in silence. sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours. If they spoke, it was often about the mundane, how the frost affected the turnips that year, or whether the sky felt heavier than usual. If they asked questions, they rarely got answers. Instead, Urgils might hum or point to the wind, or quote a stanza from one of his soaking verses, such as, "All things move, even stillness." That is why hot water cools and cool minds warm. He never called himself a teacher, and yet people left feeling as if they'd learned something. The steam circle, an accidental ritual no one remembers exactly when the tradition began. But somewhere around his 60th year, Urgils began leading small steam circles near the half-buried spring he had restored. There was no fire and brimstone preaching, no grand declarations, just a slow, deliberate ritual. First, the silent descent into the bath, then the laying of hands on warm stones, then the telling of still stories, tales so uneventful they were somehow fascinating. One of his favorites was about a woman in the East who trained ducks to sit in numerical order. Another described the mating habits of Icelandic puffins, which mate for life, but still sometimes sneak away for quiet, alone time on nearby cliffs. His point was never obvious, but that, perhaps, was the point. A philosophy without a name looking back. Some scholars suggest that Urgils was articulating an early form of what modern thinkers might call slow philosophia, worldview, centered on deliberate motion, sensory presence, and the spiritual value of repetition. He never wrote a book, but fragments of his thoughts survive, thanks in part to a curious Benedictine monk who visited from northern England in the early 1000s and documented the Bath Elder of Iceland. In one translated note, the monk writes, he speaks of warmth, not as sensation, but as companionship. The bath, he says, is where the world forgets to be sharp. Another line notes that Urgils believed cold feet were not a problem, but a reminder. They tell you where the heat stops. They help you value the rest. He also had a peculiar obsession with proper bath posture. A hunched soaker, he warned, carries burdens even into water. The spine must float like driftwood. The last bath one knows exactly when Urgils died. Some say he simply stopped walking the trails one winter. Others claim they saw him sitting in a distant pool, steam curling around his beard, eyes closed as if listening for something beneath the surface. A cairn now marks the place where he often bathed a low circle of moss-covered stones, some etched faintly with stanzas too weathered to fully read. Visitors occasionally leave small offerings, a carved spoon, A few sprigs of birch or a line of poetry etched on driftwood in 1972. An Icelandic folklorist published a slim volume titled Urgils and a Quiet Flame, arguing that this Viking bather represents a missing piece in the puzzle of Icelandic cultural heritage, a hero of conquest, but a gentle devotee of routine, stillness, and care. What he left behind today. Iceland is famous for its geothermal culture. Hot tubs are communal spaces, and pools are used for therapy, meditation, and everyday life. While no one would claim Urgils invented the tradition, there is a growing belief that he helped shape its deeper tone, not just warmth, but presence. You can still visit parts of the valley where he wandered. A few old stones remain in place, weathered, perhaps, but quietly waiting. Some believe if you sit there long enough, soaking in the fog and hush, you might begin to hear what he heard. The subtle music of steam rising, the lullaby of warm water moving over old stone. Was Urgils a philosopher ahead of his time, a simple man with a quiet obsession, or something stranger, an early reminder that meaning doesn't always come from action, but sometimes from pause? Of us took to the warm waters, not to escape the world, but to notice it. Story 2. The Emperor who banned pointy shoes. Section 1. A most undignified fashion. Crisis in medieval England. It is a truth seldom discussed in history books, certainly not with any great urgency, that for a span of roughly 150 years in medieval Europe, people were obsessed with making their shoes longer and pointier, much longer, impractically longer. And not just nobles. Everyone who could afford a cobbler began prancing around in what can only be described as leather daggers for the feet. These outlandish shoes, known as pulanes or crockhows, emerged quietly in the late 1300s and would eventually grow so long and so curled that some wearers had to tie the tips of their shoes to their leggings with bits of string to avoid tripping over themselves in public. But our story begins a little before their peak, with a man named King Edward IV of England, a monarch who, among his many concerns, wars, finances, the usual royal stuff, developed a particular distaste for footwear, or rather, for one very specific kind of footwear, a brief and pointed introduction to pulanes. Pulane didn't originate in England at all. Most historians trace it to Eastern Europe, particularly Poland, hence the name, derived from souliers, la Pulane shoes in the Polish style. They were introduced to England by knights returning from campaigns abroad and quickly adopted by fashionable nobles as a symbol of cosmopolitan taste. At first, they were modest, a slightly tapered toe, a gentle flare. But fashion, being what it is, never knows when to stop by the mid-15th century. Aristocrats were wearing poulaines that extended 6, 8, even 12 inches past the foot. These were not just shoes, they were performance art. Some were stiffened with moss or whalebone. Others were embroidered with gold thread or tipped in silver. A few were so elaborate that servants had to help their wearers walk stairs. Naturally, the clergy disapproved. Monks thundered from pulpits that the shoes were instruments of Satan and an affront to the feet God gave us. But it wasn't. Until the pointy shoes began spreading to common folk that real concern brewed in royal circles. King Edward IV, reluctant fashion regulator Redward IV, who reigned on and off during the Wars of the Roses, a rather non-sleepy affair of dynastic squabbling, was not known for his subtlety. Tall, imposing, and fond of lavish pageantry, Edward was, by most accounts, a monarch with a taste for control, particularly over how his court appeared. When Edward looked around in the early 1460s, he saw a kingdom literally tripping over itself. Court, pages stumbled while running errands. Scribes dragged in mud-covered toes. Bakers slopped dough onto their own footwear. Worst of all, a junior nobleman reportedly lost a foot race to a stable boy because his poulaines caught on a bush. That Edward could not abide such indignities. And so, in 1463, the king issued a proclamation. It was not about taxes or land. It was not even about military service. It was about shoes. No person of whatever degree shall wear any shoes or boots with pikes or points extending beyond 2 inches. Just like that, the royal hammer fell on fashion of cobblers and quiet rebellions. Of course, banning pointy shoes wasn't so simple. Cobblers across England had been earning handsomely, making these elongated horrors, and many were reluctant to give up the lucrative trend. Some try to sneak around the law. They made shoes with hidden extensions, slightly folded points tucked inward to give the illusion of modesty. Others disguised the tips with curled flaps or ornamental laces. A few particularly bold cobblers in Norwich even made detachable points that could be slipped off when the authorities arrived. The ban became something of a social experiment. Nobles shortened their shoes in public, but continued wearing long poulaines at private banquets. Apprentices dared one another to wear contraband toes on market day. Satirical songs cropped up in taverns, mocking the king with lyrics like, "The toes be trimmed, the pride be torn, but still we point from dusk till morn." Despite these acts of rebellion, the tide was turning. Fashion, like water, eventually finds its own level. The once beloved poulaine began to fall out of favor, mocked in broadsheets, blamed for bad posture, and increasingly associated with foolish vanity. When fashion meets Ladward's ban was not the first time fashion had met legislation. Throughout medieval Europe, sumptuary laws were used to control what people could wear based on class, gender, and occupation. In Florence, velvet was reserved for nobles. In France, certain fur linings were illegal for peasants. And in England, lace, embroidery, and exotic feathers were all regulated at one time or another. The idea was to prevent social confusion, to ensure that your hat said who you were without any ambiguity, but Edward's Pulain ban was unique for its practicality. He wasn't enforcing it out of moral panic or class anxiety. He just hated watching people fall downstairs. That said, enforcement was patchy at best. Most officials had bigger problems to worry about than shoes plague outbreaks, grain riots, and the occasional baronial rebellion. Still, the edict sent a message. Some limits, even on fashion, were necessary. What does it say about a kingdom when the length of a shoe becomes a matter of royal decree? And what kind of power does fashion really hold when a curve of leather can trip up more than just the wearer? Section 2. Royal Decrees, Cobbler Resistance, and the quiet politics of toes. The proclamation banning poulains may have seemed trivial, perhaps even comical at first glance. After all, the 15th century was not lacking in real crises: civil wars, famines, peasant unrest, and that ever-lingering menace plague. Yet somehow, the question of how far one's shoes extended beyond one's actual toes became a topic of genuine administrative concern. King Edward IV's proclamation wasn't a passing quip. It was enforced with surprising tenacity. And while the law itself might have been a response to what Edward viewed as sartorial nonsense, the social ripple effect was oddly complex, because beneath the surface, the fight over pointy shoes wasn't just about footwear. It was about class, identity, rebellion, a curious way fashion speaks, even when it says nothing at all. Cobbler guilds and the toe underground to understand the cultural fallout. One must understand the role of cobblers in late medieval England. These weren't mere artisans hammering away in back alley sheds. Many belonged to powerful guild organizations that regulated quality, pricing, apprenticeship, and even the aesthetics of their trade. When the Pulain ban went into effect, guilds found themselves in a bind. On the one hand, they were expected to enforce royal law among their members. On the other, they had loyal customers who still demanded the forbidden toe. Some cobblers found clever ways to interpret the ban creatively. What, after all, constituted an inch? Was it the length of the sole, the visible extension? Could curved points be counted differently than straight ones. A handful of cobblers even began advertising legal shoes with gracefully conservative flair. These shoes maintained some visual drama while keeping just within the legal toe length. Some designs turned the tips upward in a subtle curl, offering the illusion of length without actually breaking the letter of the law. Others worked in what became known in whispered circles as the toe underground in cities like York and Bristol. Secret workshops continued making extravagant plans sold privately, worn only at masked banquets or behind closed manor gates. In a twist of irony, the shoe of excess that once strutted through streets now slinked through shadows like a guilty luxury, piety, preachers, and the morality of fashion. While Edward's motivations may have been largely practical, the clergy seized on a moment with glee. Monastic sermons about vanity, already a staple of the pulpit, found new targets in the humble cobbler's window. Bishops and friars warned that pointy cues not only endangered ankles but souls. Some declared that pollaines mimicked the claws of demons. A few manuscripts from the period depict sinners in hell being dragged down by devilish figures, each wearing grotesquely elongated shoes. One particularly animated friar in Canterbury claimed that shoes longer than 5 inches invited the serpent into the body through the foot. No theological footnotes were provided for this claim. Some noble households, keen to show their moral alignment with church and crown, began burning their old poulaines in ceremonial fire pits. One record from 1465 describes a Lord's steward tossing 6 pairs of gold-threaded wicked shoes into a brazier, while a hired minstrel composed a spontaneous ballad of repentance. The refrain went, "No more shall I stumble, no more shall I slip. The devil may trip, but I shall be clipped." How the common people responded among the peasantry and urban poor. The fuss over footwear seemed faintly ridiculous. Most people owned 1 pair of shoes, maybe 2, and they were rarely fashion-forward. However, fashion always trickles down, eventually, and poulaines had started to appear even among skilled tradesmen and market vendors in larger cities. For a weaver or a brewer to sport even a modest point was a mark of aspiration. It said, "I am more than my work apron," became a subtle message. Know your place. Some chroniclers noted an uptick in street insults aimed at long-footed fools. Others claimed to witness spontaneous inspections. In public houses, where someone would lift a patron's leg under the table to check for illegal toes. Still, for every shoeless peasant forced into wooden clogs, there was a young Fletcher in Norwich saving up for one last pair of forbidden shoes, just to wear them once. in a meadow as the sun went down, because even the poorest people sometimes want to feel grand, even if just for an evening when the law is quietly forgotten like many royal edicts. The Pulain ban was most heavily enforced in the first few years and then gradually allowed to fade. By the early 1470s, shoe fashion had shifted. A new style broader, flatter toes known as duckbills began to emerge, especially in the court of Edward's successor, Henry VII. These shoes were blunt and wide, often stuffed with soft wool and better suited for the increasingly sedentary indoor life of Tudor courtiers. Pointy shoes, in contrast, had come to seem not only impractical, but a little embarrassing, a relic of a less restrained time. The Pulain didn't vanish entirely. In pockets of Europe, especially in Bohemia and the Low Countries, it persisted a while longer, and you can still find them in medieval manuscripts, worn by dancers, knights, and peasants alike. But in England, they became a curiosity, a joke, a visual shorthand for foolishness, much like the powdered wigs of later centuries. They lingered for a bit, then crumbled into the pages of history, remembered mostly by tailors, jesters, and very precise museum curators. What makes a fashion trend endure? Why do some styles fade with a fizzle, while others vanish overnight, slain by royal decree? And who gets to decide when something is merely ridiculous, officially illegal? Section 3. The Rise and Fall of Footwear Power. How Shoes Shaped a Kingdom by the time Edward IV's Pulain ban had lost its teeth in the 1470s. The Kingdom of England had, perhaps unknowingly, moved on from an age of absurd shoe tips and into something more subdued. A few decades later, Henry VIII would stomp about the court in square-toed monstrosities, stuffed with wool and layered in gold. But for a brief, bright moment, the length of one's shoes had symbolized something far more intricate: class, identity, resistance, even national pride. What began as a foreign novelty brought home by knights had ballooned into a fashion arms race, then collapsed beneath the weight of its own impracticality and the king's patience. But the story of the Pulain was never truly about the shoes. It was about the people who wore them, or tried to dot shoes as silent speech, an age before mass communication. The human body, clothed, adorned, scented, shoed, was a billboard. Your shoes told people how wealthy you were, how cosmopolitan, how daring. Were you a merchant who wanted to appear noble, a noble who wanted to seem devout, a city apprentice eager to catch a shopkeeper's daughter's eye? The shoes answered for you. A well-dressed man with modest boots might be taken for a thoughtful steward or a cleric's assistant. A man with pointed pulains gilded at the toe, might be seen as ambitious, vain, or simply in fashion. And therein lay the trouble. When everyone began wearing them, when even the fishmonger's son began strutting in soft, curled Pulain's status lines blurred, and in a rigidly hierarchical society that made people nervous, Edward IV's decree then wasn't just about trip hazards. It was a quiet campaign to return the visual order of society, an attempt to rein in the overreach of aspiration, and, perhaps in his own way, a concern for the safety of stairs and spiral tower landings. But laws can't fully erase symbols, especially ones so easily made, sold, and mimicked fashion as a form of rebellion. There's a delicious irony in how often rebellious acts in history are quiet, aesthetic, and deeply personal. The long Pool Lane became, in time, a symbol of soft defiance, not just against the king, but against the creeping pressures of conformity. Consider the shoemakers who secretly crafted outlawed shoes under lantern light, stitching long leather tips while keeping the shop's outer shelf filled with regulation-compliant footwear. Or the teenagers in London, alleys who swapped Pulains after dusk and dared each other to parade past the local magistrate, or the miner. Clerics who, robes flowing, kept wearing subtle, extended shoes beneath their cassocks, hiding them during morning mass, revealing them by candlelight in cloisters. These were not grand revolts, but they mattered. They remind us that rebellion needn't roar. Sometimes it whispers across cobblestones in a curl of tool-long leather, laughing softly when no one trips. The inevitable pendulum of style when fashion tips too far into absurdity. History always calls it back. The Pulain fell out of favor not just because of legislation or religious condemnation, but because trends shifted. Shoes became wider, flatter, less flamboyant. Austerity returned to the wardrobe as Europe edged closer to the Reformation, with its distaste for excessive adornment. But the human desire to decorate, to express, to belong, to stand out never really leaves. In the 1600s, French courtiers would battle over the height of their red-heeled shoes. In the 1700s, powdered wigs replaced pointed shoes as the most outlandish display of fashion excess. And in the 21st century, runway designers would gleefully resurrect Pulains as ironic statements, sending models down catwalks in 15-inch toe extensions. It all comes back, eventually. Even the ridiculous, especially the ridiculous, the echo of a footstep. So, we leave our story in the dust of the medieval street, where horses clop over cobbles and the soft scuff of elongated shoes fades around a market corner. In truth, Edward For's law did little to permanently change how people express themselves. But it did capture a moment in history when something as mundane as footwear revealed a kingdom's anxieties, ambitions, an evolving sense of identity. Shoes may seem small, decorative, disposable, but sometimes they carry the entire story of a people, pointed, curved, stitched, and smuggled one step at a time. What else might we learn if we looked down more often in history? Not at the grand declarations or famous battles, but at the everyday, at the things worn, patched, banned, and borrowed. Might the smallest details tell us the biggest truths? Story 3. The Sultan's Sleep Schedule That Lasted 18 Hours. Section 1. A Napped Taking. Empire and the Ottoman obsession with leisure. If you had wandered the halls of Topkapi Palace on a mid-afternoon in the mid-17th century, you might have found the corridors eerily silent. The servants moved like whispers, carpets muffled every footstep, and the royal guards, usually stone-faced and upright, slouched in shaded alcoves, stifling yawns. The reason for this peculiar stillness: the Sultan was napping, and not just a quick doze. If the stories are to be believed, Sultan Ibrahim I, who ruled the vast Ottoman Empire from 1640 to 1648, was known to spend upward of 18 hours a day asleep, while the empire's bureaucracy whirred and creaked in the background. Its highest authority often slumbered, curled in a sea of silks and cushions, drifting through dreams while ministers and concubines treaded carefully around him. But this wasn't merely the quirk of one eccentric ruler. In fact, sleep and leisure were deeply interwoven into Ottoman court culture and the peculiar patterns of rest, ritual, and royal avoidance formed a tapestry that tells us much about power, isolation, and human fragility. At the top, the Ottoman concept of leisuring like some European courts that equated idle hands with the devil's influence. The Ottoman elite held a more nuanced view of rest. Leisure, in the context of court life, was a mark of control and divinity. A working man sweated. A sultan was to be served, swayed and serenely still. His body did not labor, was to be preserved. In this view, sleep wasn't laziness. It was almost sacred. Sultans were surrounded by vast harems, carefully selected eunuchs, and learned advisors. Adore, and rarely did anything that might require physical exertion. When not handling court matters, the expected behavior was one of composed indulgence, poetry readings, slow strolls in ornate gardens, and, of course, rest. The palace itself was designed to facilitate this life of gentle detachment. Topkapi was a sprawling compound, not unlike a small city. filled with courtyards, bathing chambers, and private pavilions for napping. Ottoman court etiquette even dictated how long visitors could speak, how low they should bow, and how far they should stand to avoid disturbing the Sultan's peace. In such an environment, sleep naturally became a reigning pastime. Sultan Ibrahim I, a life cocooned in cushions Ibrahim I, known later by the unfortunate nickname Ibrahim the Mad, was not meant to rule. He was born the youngest of Sultan Ahmed, the first's sons, and spent much of his early life imprisoned in the infamous caves, or Khaja suite, within the palace, where potential heirs were kept under close guard, lest they threaten the throne. He spent years there with no duties, no real interaction, and only the muffled hum of the outer palace for company. He ate, read, and slept by the time his brother, Sultan Murad IV, died and the throne passed to Ibrahim in 1640. The new Sultan was already deeply shaped by his cocooned, sedentary upbringing. He was cautious, easily tired, and famously uninterested in the burdens of governance. Sleep was, for Ibrahim, not just a preference, it was perhaps his last comfort. The royal routine accounts of Ibrahim's reign suggest a peculiar daily pattern. Brief windows of activity, often late in the morning or after sunset, followed by long stretches of sleep or recline. Courtiers often had to schedule even the simplest of affairs like ceremonial meetings or the presentation of foreign ambassadors around these sleeping hours. A French envoy once waited 3 full days to present a gift to the Sultan, only to be dismissed after 5 minutes because Ibrahim felt another rest coming on. Even during important council meetings, which he rarely attended in person, the Sultan would sometimes be informed of urgent matters while reclining behind a curtain, eyes half closed. Decisions would be made between yawns or delayed until he awoke fully, which could take several days. Palace physicians, alarmed by this heavy sleeping, prescribed gentle massages, spiced teas, and even imported saffron to stimulate wakefulness. Nothing worked. Ibrahim returned to his divan, his eyes fluttering closed. Some believed the years in the caves had permanently altered his energy. Others whispered that his preference for slumber was spiritual, that he believed dreams connected him to God more directly than waking hours ever could. Whether apathy or mysticism, the result was the same: a kingdom gently drifting along while its ruler dreamed. The empire sleeps with its ruler, yet for all his quirks. Ibrahim's reign was not immediately catastrophic. The Ottoman Empire, after all, was a machine built to run on inertia. Even as the Sultan dozed, his viziers, generals, and bureaucrats handled affairs. Orders were signed, ships dispatched, taxes collected. In a strange way, the Sultan's prolonged absence from daily affairs allowed a certain flexibility among the governing elite. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, among others, wielded tremendous unofficial power, issuing edicts and reforms while shielding the Sultan from too much strain. There was even a silver lining for the citizens of the empire during these early years. Military campaigns were fewer and less brutal. With a sleepy Sultan, there was no appetite for conquest, no energy for expansion. Trade flourished quietly. Taxes remained predictable. Some merchants even thanked the stars for a ruler more interested in naps than in wars. But not all was peaceful under the covers. Whispers in the palace hinted that the Sultan's retreat was turning into paranoia. His dreams, they said, grew stranger and more vivid. He claimed to have seen omens. He grew suspicious of his concubines, believing some tried to curse him through poisoned pillows. He dismissed advisors for waking him too early. The world outside his chamber became a threat, and so his sleeping hours lengthened even more. What happens to a kingdom when its ruler dreams more than he rules? And what truths sift any due leaders find in the shadows of their slumber? Section 2. Palaces, Pillows, and Power. The machinery behind a sleeping monarch. To understand how a vast empire functioned under a monarch who spent most of his time asleep, we must peel back the layers of Ottoman court life, layers built not just on marble and mosaic, but on silence, strategy, and the careful manipulation of perception. Because, make no mistake, while Sultan Ibrahim I slept, the empire most certainly did not. A government built to outlive its rulers. The Ottoman system was paradoxically both centralized and self-sustaining. At its peak, the empire stretched from Hungary to the Horn of Africa, encompassing dozens of languages, religions, and ethnic groups. It required an immense administrative machine to keep the wheels turning, and this machine was deliberately constructed to function with minimal direct interference from the Sultan. This structure was not an accident. Centuries of dynastic turbulence had taught the Ottomans a valuable lesson. Sultans came and went, and not all were equal. Some were brilliant, like Suleiman the Magnificent. Others, like Ibrahim Dash, were ... less energetic ... to prevent chaos. A professionalized bureaucracy emerged. At its heart was the Divan, the imperial council, staffed by viziers, judges, financial experts, and military leaders. The Grand Vizier functioned as a kind of imperial CEO, fielding decisions, overseeing taxes, deploying armies, and ensuring the Sultan's vague wishes were translated into actual governance. This delegation meant that, in theory, the empire could survive long periods of royal inertia. In practice, however, the personal whims of the Sultan still mattered, especially when those whims drifted between fever dreams and strange obsessions. The harem, power behind the curtains, perhaps. Nowhere did Sultan Ibrahim's sleep habits ripple more powerfully than in the harem, that inner sanctum of the palace where hundreds of women, servants, and eunuchs lived, maneuvered, and waited. The word harem often conjures images of sensual luxury, but it was, more accurately, a political pressure cooker. Women in the harem, particularly the valid sultan or sultan's mother, were among the most politically influential figures in the empire, and under a sleeping ruler, their influence only deepened. Ibrahim's mother, Qasim Sultan, was a formidable power broker. She had guided the empire through previous transitions and now found herself, once again, serving as the stabilizing force behind the throne. When Ibrahim drifted off for hours, war days, Qasim made decisions in his name. She negotiated with the Grand Vizier, brokered court. In effect, she became a coroller, and some whispered she was the real sultan in all but name. Others in the harem sought similar influence. Favorite concubines jostled for Ibrahim's fleeting attention, not just for affection, but for the political capital it brought. A whispered request between pillows could result in a military promotion or the dismissal of a powerful courtier. Sleep, in this sense, became a kind of currency. Access to the Sultan during waking hours was rare and precious, and those who could shape his dreams, even more powerful dreams, as diplomacy, Ottoman culture. Dreams were not just idle nonsense. They were seen as omens, even messages from the divine. This belief wasn't limited to peasants or mystics. It permeated the court. Dream interpreters, called tabarishi, were employed to make sense of the night visions reported by royalty. Sultan Ibrahim, prone to long and elaborate dreams, became increasingly reliant on such interpretations. Ministers and family members learned quickly if a decision could be justified through a favorable dream reading. The Sultan was far more likely to approve it. This created an odd dynamic. Bureaucrats would time their petitions with the Sultan's post-dream wakefulness. Concubines might suggest a dream they had to influence Ibrahim's thinking. Even Qasim Sultan was rumored to encourage certain narratives, implying that the stars had whispered a particular course of action into her son's ears while he slept. Thus, dreams became a diplomatic tool, policy by pillow, and in some cases, manipulation by metaphor, from cushions to crisis, but, as with many delicate systems, cracks began to form. In 1644, a group of Maltese pirates raided Ottoman ships and attacked pilgrims en route to Mecca. This sparked outrage in the empire, but it took days for a clear directive from the palace. Ibrahim, still deep in his seasonal sleep phase, refused to meet with advisors until he felt sufficiently rested. Eventually, under pressure from his mother and Grand Vizier, he ordered a retaliatory campaign. But the slow response was noted. Whispers of incompetence began to circulate, not just in the court, but among provincial governors, merchants, and the army. And then came the silken incident. The fur fetish and the velvet edicts, according to multiple sources, some scandalous, others dryly diplomatic. Sultan Ibrahim developed a powerful fixation on fabrics, especially ermine and sable. He issued decrees demanding new collections of furs be brought to the palace each month. His chambers were refitted in ever more lavish velvets. The treasury, already strained by wars and palace expenses, began to groan under the weight of the Sultan's indulgence. And still, he slept. By 1647, officials could no longer ignore the strange rhythm of rule. Governors in the provinces complained of delayed orders. Soldiers waited months for pay. A once silent empire began to murmur. Even the common folk began to joke quietly, behind closed doors, that they had a sultan of dreams, not deeds. Still, no one dared openly challenge the sultan. Yet, how long can a state function on momentum alone in bureaucracy, memory, and the thin threads of protocol? And what happens when even dreams begin to unravel? Section 3. The Empire Awakens, Rebellion, Removal, and the Strange Legacy of the Sleepy Sultan by 1648. The Ottoman Empire stood at an uneasy crossroads. For nearly 8 years, its ruler had existed more in dreams than in daylight. Ibrahim I, eccentric, insulated, and increasingly erratic, had become a living ghost within his own palace. His days were largely spent in bedchambers, thick with incense and hushed servants. His decisions reduced to whispered commands between naps, while ministers and viziers managed to keep the outer workings of the empire afloat. The center had begun to rot. It was a moment ripe for change. But, as with all dynasties, change in the Ottoman court rarely came gently. The last straw, furs, fatigue, and financial ruin, one of the final episodes of Ibrahim's rule centered, strangely enough, on furs. By the late 1640s, his obsession with luxurious textiles, particularly ermine pelts, had reached an almost feverish intensity. One report claimed he ordered the entire contents of Istanbul's fur markets to be brought to the palace, only to have them dumped in a room and left untouched. Another whispered that he slept atop a custom mattress lined with sable, refusing to rise unless the pelts were soft enough for dreams. But the economic consequences were far from whimsical. The treasury, already burdened by the costs of military campaigns and court maintenance, began to falter. Tax collectors grew more aggressive. Inflation spiked salaries for the janissaries. The empire's elite soldiers were delayed again and again. The janissaries were not pleased. The final insult came when Ibrahim ordered the execution of several harem women, accusing them without clear evidence of plotting to curse him in his sleep. The court was horrified. Kig's Sultan, his once fierce defender, grew silent. The Grand Vizier looked to the janissaries. The balance had shifted, and then the palace doors quietly opened. A coup in slippers on a warm August day in 1648. The janissaries marched on Topkapi. There was no great clash of swords, no siege, no blood in the streets. The entire affair was eerily hushed, almost in line with the slumbrous tone of the Sultan's reign. The janissaries surrounded the palace. Viziers offered no resistance. Kaiksim Sultan gave her silent blessing, and Ibrahim was quietly escorted from his chambers, reportedly confused and still half asleep. He was removed from power without ceremony and imprisoned once more in the caves, the same gilded cage where he had spent his youth. His 6-year-old son, Mehmed IV, was installed as Sultan. Real power returned temporarily to Kaiksem Sultan and the ruling elite. The dream was over. Less than 2 weeks later, Ibrahim was strangled on execution, carried out with the traditional Ottoman method of a silk cord. To avoid shedding royal blood, he was 33 years old. Legacy in silence. Ibrahim I is remembered in history books with a mixture of pity and ridicule. His nickname, Ibrahim the Mad, has colored nearly every account of his reign. But beneath the eccentricities lies a portrait of a man deeply shaped by fear, isolation, and centuries of dynastic paranoia. He wasn't the first Ottoman ruler to favor sleep over statecraft, nor would he be the last. His story raises deeper questions about the nature of power and performance. What does it mean to be a ruler if you rarely rule? Can an empire truly be governed in absentia by ministers and mothers and machinery? And how many decisions in history, large or small, have been delayed or derailed because someone somewhere at the top simply wanted 5 more minutes in bed? There is a curious tranquility in Ibrahim's reign, as if the empire itself hit pause for 8 years. No grand conquests, just a softly breathing empire padding along while its ruler dreamed of ermine, and omens today. The quiet chambers of Topkapi still stand. The gardens grow. The fountains whisper. And if you walk past the old quarters of the Sultan and pause in the shaded breeze, you might imagine the faintest sound of snoring, a strange reminder that sometimes history doesn't march, sometimes it naps.